Can somebody let me know? Can somebody let me know if that looks all right?
Perfect.
Good, great. Yeah, so my name is David Warwick, and I'm one of the directors here at EG Technology. As Rosette said, we specialize in the design and development of medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. It accounts for probably about 70% of the work that we do. Oh, hang on, let me just get rid of that thing that's in the middle of my screen. Got it. And by way of personal background, my original technical training was in software development, so software engineer by profession. But I've probably been in the medical sector for getting on for 20 years now, firstly at medical and biotech startups around the Cambridge area in the UK, getting devices through CE marking and FDA approval. And then in my time at EG Technology, which is getting on for 14 years now, I think, worked with a wide range of companies, whether it's sort of mechanical, electromechanical, software-based medical devices, helping both develop the product and get it through the regulatory process. And so what I wanted to do today was run through some aspects of software design for medical devices. As Caroline said, it's a really broad topic. But what I'm hoping to do today is touch on a few areas in terms of practical experience, really, because rather it's quite easy to go on training courses, and there are lots of good ones out there about what the process of medical device software development is and how to follow this standard 62304. But it's easy to come away from those sort of thinking, so what? And how do I actually have to do it? What does that actually mean? So what I'm hoping to do today is kind of craft that with a little bit more real world experience, some approaches you can take as you're going through your medical device development. And we'll also touch on aspects towards the end of sort of ongoing software maintenance. There's a big aspect to regulatory approval that happens after you've initially launched your device onto the market. And cybersecurity and things like AI and machine learning are becoming increasingly popular in this sector and coming under increasing scrutiny. So we'll touch on those very briefly as well. So first of all, we can't really start the talk without setting the scene a little bit. There are two key standards, I suppose, associated with software in the broad medical sector. So the main one is IEC 62304, and that is about the software lifecycle process for medical devices. Now there's an overlapping standard with a very similar name called 82304, which is about health software. So that's software which has a sort of a wellness aspect to it, or a sort of physical well-being, health support type software, but doesn't actually fall under the definition of a medical device. What you'll see here is that there's a certain amount of overlap. So you have software which, I guess, the traditional view, software that is part of a piece of medical device hardware, whether that's a handheld or a big piece of lab equipment or something like that. It's software that's been written bespoke to go along with some hardware. There's also software as a medical device, and that's becoming increasingly popular, and there are lots of new bits of software coming into the market that have a very specific medical purpose. They are a medical device, but they run on general purpose IT equipment. Of course, most of us are now carrying around things like smartphones in our pockets, and so which have huge amounts of computing power, along with the PCs and laptops and things which you can find in most offices, in most GPs, surgeries, all of those sorts of things. But there's a grey area, because while some of that software is for medical devices, some of it is just this health supporting software, and that's where 82304 comes in. 82304 is very much about software which runs on general purpose IT equipment, but doesn't actually make medical claims. But the important message to take from this slide, though, is although the two standards are different, they cover much of the same software life cycle. The fact that you have to initially define your software architecture, go through the requirements for that software, then develop it and then test it. Actually, the processes are very similar. And the other thing I want to, or I will be stressing throughout this talk, is that much of medical device software development can also be considered as good practice, good design and development practice for software and more broadly product development anyway. So software development for medical devices is not something to be scared about. It's just about following a well thought out, carefully designed process. So the previous slide, we were talking about the difference between a medical device and health software. And the way you make that determination is by considering what is the intended use of the device. And the definition of a medical device, or indeed an in vitro diagnostic, comes from the applicable regulations. So in the EU, that's the MDR or IVDR. The FDA have very similar standards, and globally, depending on the territories that you're looking to enter, there will be some national or regional regulation that sets the requirements to get onto the market. The question is really where the boundary lies between medical device and health software, but this is where you always need to take a step back and make sure you're very clear about your intended use. And what I would encourage you to do as the very first step is to try and write down that intended use. If you're applying to the FDA and also as part of a medical device regulation application, you need to be very clear about what your product does, and the action of writing down what that intended use is in a short 1 or 2 paragraphs can be a lot harder than you think. You have a good general description of what your product does, but when you actually try to codify it into a few sentences, a couple of paragraphs, that can become more difficult, and it has really big implications for your product development, your medical device development as a whole, because the words that you put into that statement can govern everything from whether it's a medical device, whether it's health software, whether it's an in vitro diagnostic, through to the clinical claims you're making, whether it can diagnose, whether it provides decision support, whether it's life supporting or physiological monitoring. The next step from there is to then think about the hazards that are controlled by the software. And so then you start delving down into the detail of the software itself. So not what the system does, but what does the software control? What are the risks that can be contributed to by the software itself, and maybe directly, indirectly caused by the software? The basic requirements of 62304 build really upon the higher level requirements from the regulations of having quality management systems in place, the risk management process which applies for all medical devices, and the software safety classification, and we'll delve into those a little bit more in the next couple of slides. So at the very top level, we have medical device classification. There's detail on how you run through that in the MDR document itself. Annex 8 gives you the rules and classification criteria, and relatively recently there has been some additional guidance published on the interpretation of those rules. But what you might often find is a bit more of an ad hoc approach, which I've got listed at the top there. So class 1 is a medical device that can't hurt you. Class 3 is a medical device that can kill you, and class A and 2A and 2B sit somewhere in the middle of that scale of seriousness. but actually the results can be quite surprising. If you run through that Annex 8 checklist in detail, you'll find that it's relatively few devices that actually go all the way into class 3, because these are the most serious life-supporting devices, devices that touch the central nervous system, the central circulatory system, things that provide an immediate threat to health if they go wrong. What that means is that the vast majority of devices probably sit in the class 2A or class 2B designation. And what we'll see in the next couple of slides is that you should use the overall device classification to think a little bit more about your software development processes and the software safety classification that's required as part of the 62304 process. But first, it's just worth talking briefly about the wording in the MDR. So I just said that you need to think about the classification of your entire device to help you start thinking about the risks inherent in the software. At the start of Annex 8, there's a section which talks about software which drives or influences the use of a device, falls into the same class of as that device. So that means that software running on a class 2B device is going to be class 2B software, something like that. But there can be differences because it depends on the level of interaction between the software and the device. And indeed, of course, you might have software as a medical device which has no hardware associated with it. So you do need to look at all the other classification rules to see if they apply to the software as part of a system. But there's also a rule 11 which covers software specifically, and again it's talking about the relative risk in the software. So software that's designed to take decisions with diagnostic or therapeutic purposes is class 2A, except if it's likely to lead to death or a serious deterioration in health, it's class 3. Sorry, death would be a class 3. Serious deterioration in health would be a class 2B. Physiological process monitoring is class 2A, unless it's monitoring vital signs, something that could result in an immediate danger to the patient. And then a catch-all rule that if your device falls under the definition of a medical device, then all software is going to be at least class 1. Oops, sorry, just move on to the next slide. What's happened there? There we go. So then you start looking at the 62304 standard, and within there is a software safety classification. And so if you remember my ad hoc rules for the MDR, class 1 can't really hurt you, class 3 is going to kill you. There's the classification for software safety actually broadly follows along the same lines. So class A has no serious injury or damage to health is possible. Class B, non-serious injury. We'll talk a little bit more about what on earth non-serious means if you've got injured. And class C, death or serious injury is possible. The reason that's important is, as shown in that illustration on the right-hand side, that the level of rigor you have to put into your software development process depends on the classification that you give to the software. And as you would expect, the more serious the classification of the software, the more likely it is to lead to patient harm, the more rigor you need to put into your development process. But I would counsel you to avoid talking yourself into implausible worst case scenarios. It's very easy doing the risk assessment to think about a chain of events that leads to death. If this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then the patient suffers some serious consequences. You have to roll that back a little bit and think about whether the software can really influence that there and now. If the software fails on that occasion, can you reboot the system and run the test again? Or are there other diagnostic tests that are used to support what the software is doing? To what extent is a clinician's professional judgment and their experience used as part of the process? And so for something like class C, the highest level of designation, it can be a little bit easy to talk yourself into that, but I would really encourage you to think about, is the risk immediate? Is it life-threatening? Is it right now? Or if it's further down the line, what other steps are there in the clinical process that means actually the software is only class B? There are other follow-up activities that need to be done before the patient will suffer a serious consequence. Just a really quick word on why we use 62304. This is because the use of harmonized standards gives the presumption of conformity to the regulatory requirements. So the regulatory requirements are the law. They're what you have to meet to put your product onto the market. So that is the MDR, the IVDR, FDA regulations. The UK are now separate, but we are still aligned with the old MDD at the moment. We're looking at a new one to come out in 2023. But actually, the global regulatory picture is more aligned than you may think, and all geographical locations tend to align with international standards in terms of providing presumption of conformity to the rules within that region. So this is why medical device companies have 13485 quality processes, why you'll hear a lot about risk management to 14971, and why we talk about medical device software being developed to 62304. It's the recognized standard for CE marking, for UK CA marking. It's a consensus standard in the States, although there can be some really, really small differences in detail region to region. Broadly speaking, if you follow the standard, you're following the processes that are required for everywhere that you're going to want to sell your device. The other reason that you want to do it is that for example, in the MDR, it talks about following state of the art, and that you read state of the art and you think, oh my goodness, that means we've got to be cutting edge, bleeding edge of development. And that's not at all what it means. State of the art means generally accepted state of the art. It means best practice, and that's where we come back to application of the standards for development. Following 62304 means you are following state of the art for software development processes. So 62304 is the title includes the phrase software lifecycle processes, and it establishes the tasks that you need to go through for safe design and critically maintenance of medical device software. It does make the assumption that your software is developed within a broader quality management system, and it leans heavily on the risk management processes in 14971. But if you are a medical device development company or an in vitro diagnostic development company, these standards ought to be very familiar with you, and your broader development needs to take account of them as well. Unlike something like 13485, which is generally a sort of a company-wide certificate or accreditation for the processes that you follow, 62304 is applied to the device itself that you're developing. So it's like electrical safety testing, or it's like considering risk management. You can't be accredited as an organization to 62304. It's the device that and the software you develop for that device that has to meet the life cycle processes. So you apply those principles to your development, and you incorporate the processes by which you achieve that into your quality management system. Now, if you come from a software background, you might be thinking, well, can I use something like Agile software development? Can I use techniques like Scrum to develop my software? Because this is the kind of terminology and the processes that software developers are more familiar with. And the answer is Yes, absolutely, you can. There's even been, there's plenty of literature out there talking about the benefits and the compatibility of agile development processes with the development of medical device software. Because actually, when you dig into it, agile really actually allows you to, it's based around quite a robust change management process. It's about controlling the software development process overall. And that's really well aligned with the objectives of 62304 and the product development lifecycle. So the best processes we tend to find are those which really sort of mesh between what the developers are familiar with and are willing to work to, familiar with working to, and the requirements of 62304 and medical device development in general. So having sort of thought a little bit about the standards overall, how do we then go about putting the software together? So in the second part of this talk, I want to talk a little bit more about how you scope out large software projects. How do you draw a boundary around what the software does, but how do you do that in a way which allows you to maintain flexibility, allows you to issue updates without going through huge amounts of retesting or resubmission, because I'm sure many of you will be aware that the regulatory process, particularly in Europe for the MDR and IVDR, all the notified bodies have extensive timescales and lead times on actually doing product reviews. And the answer really is to evaluate the risks and start with a software architecture that's going to provide you with a real solid foundation for the future. In doing so, by creating an architecture that hopefully accounts for those future changes, you're going to try to maintain flexibility in your development, but at the same time and then only need major updates when appropriate for the changes that you've made. So in general, the software system takes on the same risk category as the most risky subsection of the software item or items within the system. But fortunately, the standard gives you a bit of maneuver on this by creating the correct software architecture and the correct segregation early on in the project. In my experience, both making submissions in both Europe and the US, it's really down to the manufacturer to provide the justification for that design segregation and provide the justification for your architecture. If you do that in a well thought out, logical way, then I think you'll find 9 times out of 10 that the regulatory authorities will be happy to accept your approach. So the first thing that we do when we're thinking about a project is consider whether the risks arising from the software can actually be mitigated in hardware. If there are hardware controls that you can put into place, then actually this is a good approach. If you have easily measurable parameters where a cutout type function can ensure the worst risks are mitigated, you might then be able to bring the safety classification of your software down because it's doing progressively less safety critical aspects of the work. The other way to think about this is that the software can only control the system within a safe range. The hardware is providing all of the key safety backups for software safety. Within that range, you've still got a whole bunch of risks associated with suboptimal treatment, risks of lower level of harms, but what we're talking really about here is the very highest level of risks, those death or serious injury risks that would mean you were a Class C. By mitigating those, you can potentially argue that the software alone falls into Class B. But in many systems, the determination of an error requires a more complex measurement than something like a simple single point value and a cutout based on being either side of those values. It might be that you need to measure a number of parameters simultaneously, and some combination of those needs to be determined for safety. In that case, you can segregate the design similar to what I've put on the screen here, by thinking about an architecture which moves the key functional safety elements into a separate subsystem from what operates all of the main functions of the device. And this again is a technique that we regularly use. So you have a very small, very tightly controlled subset of code running on a safety processor whose entire function is to mitigate those top level risks, those high level risks. That means that the safety processor can potentially sit in a high level, higher software safety classification, whilst the main processor can sit in a slightly lower level of classification. And the benefit there is that the changes that you are more likely to want to make as your product matures are, can be centered around the user experience, the user display, things that are actually non-critical aspects of performance. And that allows you to make updates to the main part of the system, the user experience of the system, without touching those really critical aspects which are separated off. The other way that we've used in the past, and this kind of technique is often used for sort of in vitro diagnostic and process based systems, is sometimes it's not about the function of an individual component, it's the order in which they're used, it's the order in which the sample is processed that's actually critical. And so in some designs, it may be possible to separate out the control of the hardware from the operational sequence of that hardware. So your design and development process allows you to build the software that you need to drive the pumps and the valves, and you can quite rigorously and reliably test the functionality of each of those pieces of hardware to determine that they are definitely going to work properly. But the medical value, the clinical value, the risky bit of the process, if you like, is the sequence of operations by which you filter, sample, mix, blend, whatever it is, your assay, and it's actually those parts that are critical for medical efficacy, and so you control those separately. The other good aspect to this approach is that you can rigorously test the software execution of those that sequence of events, sort of programmatically using unit testing and other sort of software-based techniques there, rather than having to actually run multiple experiments. Your clinical evidence is then based around just performing those experiments at the end of the overall process. But a change in the order of operations needed clinically doesn't necessarily require a complete software retest, because you've already determined that each of those functional components is going to work correctly, provided that the instructions that you give it are within the overarching acceptable parameters. And the reason that we segregate the design this way is so that any changes that you make are measured and managed appropriately according to the risks associated with them. So what you have on the one side is things like look and feel, reports that might get spat out of the devices, databases that might get populated with log data and those sorts of things that aren't actually critical to the safety of the software can possibly be changed without a new regulatory submission. The things that are critical, you know what they are, and so you know if you touch those areas, then you need to go and think about talking to your notified body, talking to whoever accredits your system. So that would be things like the if you change the underlying operating system or the task scheduling, if there's any aspects that are critical to performance, critical diagnostic algorithms, changes to those are likely to require much greater scrutiny, both by you and are probably the competent authorities are probably going to want those looked at as well. And that's because it's post-market aspects of software that they're really worried about. So there's a couple of little quotes there. So in the UK, over the previous in January 2019, 58 medical device alerts, of which 22% included a specific reference to software. The FDA quote there is relatively out of date now, but it shows perhaps where current legislation is coming from. That the defects were introduced when changes were made to software after its initial introduction into the market and its initial distribution. And so large parts of 62304 are really focused on software maintenance and release after intended use. So this can cover things like corrective actions, such as fixing faults. But there's people familiar with developing software will realize that it's often not just about bug fixing. It's about making improvements to your system, improvements to your device, or adapting to new uses of your device over time. It's very easy these days, particularly if we're talking about software as a medical device, software that runs on general purpose IT equipment, to push updates out to the market. And so this kind of area is becoming under increased scrutiny, from two particular aspects, both in terms of looking at cybersecurity, which we'll think about in a second, and the potential implications of forthcoming software, which is based around machine learning and AI as well. So cybersecurity is a really sort of hot topic at the moment, because there's very significant concern over privacy and security issues, because so many new medical devices are now becoming connected. And what we're seeing these days is that everybody who makes regulatory submissions has to have a very robust section on how they address any cybersecurity concerns. One of the easiest ways to do that, of course, is to make sure that your device totally stands alone, is totally isolated, but increasingly that's not really possible, because new devices are reliant on potentially on cloud-based functionality, on data collection to improve and expand algorithms, and if you're earlier in the market, things like clinical trials and those sorts of things, obviously data security is equally important. And so cybersecurity is really interested in how your system might be vulnerable to security breaches, and they're pretty keen on making sure that you think about all of the potential impacts and all the potential routes into your device, whether it is sort of internet connected, there's an obvious risk there, but also if it provides any communication ports that are accessible on the device. If it provides something as simple as Bluetooth connectivity to an accessory or something like that, all of those are points of potential weakness. So you need to think very carefully about how to keep your device safe and secure, and of course, how to keep any patient data that's recorded appropriately confidential. So there's although 62304 doesn't deal specifically with data security from that aspect, things like GDPR and confidentiality do factor heavily in your design decisions. At the same time, and in the same way that I talked about not wanting to sort of over-egg the risks of the devices, it's important to not go too far with this, because at the early stage of the product, you need to be able to get your product out there onto the market. You need to evaluate the risks of breaches. But if you're using industry standard things, if you're using a secure connection to something like Amazon Web Services to gather the data, you need to bear in mind that that sort of level of security, that sort of level of data protection is regarded as state of the art. If you think about data collection more broadly, so something like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, these are systems used throughout the world. They're used very broadly to gather all sorts of data, and they're under attack all the time. They're stress tested all the time. The idea that you should you would be able to self-build a system that is more robust is perhaps not the way to go. I'm not sure if that was a question or just some background noise. Okay. Yeah, so it's important to outweigh the residual risks. So this applies quite broadly, and increasingly as devices become more connected, it's possible to build a regulatory argument around the robustness of third-party parts of the system as being more robust than something you'd be able to develop in-house. So if you think about the operating system platforms that your IT might run on, whether that's sort of Android, iOS, Windows, whatever it may be, that's used all over the world every day for all sorts of activities. And therefore it's undergoing a huge amount of testing there's all sorts of hacking implications associated with it, and you have big teams of people working around those problems for you, rather than trying to self-craft something that is compliant. The other big aspect of software development, and something that's really kind of a major issue at the moment, is artificial intelligence and machine learning. Again, it's a very popular area for development at the moment, and all major healthcare regulators are really looking at this in a huge amount of detail as to how they can regulate for it, because it's somewhat unique in the medical device space. There's actually consultations out at the moment, or I think the EU one might have just closed, but the EU are consulting on how to regulate artificial intelligence. The FDA have consultations open, have action plans put out specifically for software as a medical device, which incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning. Because of the length of time some of these processes take, it might actually be quite a bit of time until we have really definitive guidance or any international standards that govern this. But again, the focus stays on continued safety and efficacy. So where some of these consultations are focusing at the moment are things like the size and scope and quality of your initial training data, and understanding how you've gathered that, how you control it, how you preserve the data integrity of it. And then having trained your system, having launched your system, how you control in-market adaptations of the software. How do you know as the system gathers more data, as it grows, as it continues to build and learn, that it's still safe and effective? If you think about it, it's still an extension of that philosophy from a few slides ago. The concern is not really at the front end of a development and the initial performance of your algorithms. Those can be relatively well proven. It's what happens when it's out there in the wild, as it grows, as it's updated, in this case, as it's adapting itself. How do you ensure that it continues to be safe and effective? And most of the consultation is looking at means by which it can be monitored. So the MDR, for example, has introduced a great deal more emphasis on continued clinical evaluation of products after they've been put onto the market, particularly high category medical devices need regular updates to the clinical evaluation of their performance. My gut feeling is that artificial intelligence and ML will go in a similar way, that manufacturers will be required to provide some level of evidence that the adaptations of their systems over time continue to offer the same high levels of safety and efficacy that they did when the product was launched onto the market. But without definitive guidance to fall back on, you really just need to remember that the important point is to follow good design, development, and maintenance practice. And by following 62304, you are following what is still currently state of the art for medical device development. So before we move on to any questions really from anybody that's listening, so just a quick summary of the conclusions. There's considerable overlap between the 62304 and 82304 standards. They both talk about a life cycle process for software, and more broadly, you should really think about good design and development approaches for the software, but these can be aligned with development processes that software engineers are familiar with, like Agile. Your software development needs to be linked in with your overall quality management system and the overall risk assessment of your product or of your product, and the software development process adopts, as does the whole medical device development process, a risk-based approach. But be pragmatic. Don't overdo it or underdo it. The exercise of documenting your decisions is a really good discipline to go through, because it forces you to be explicit about the approach that you're taking. Make sure you plan your maintenance and upgrade strategy, and I think if anybody listening is in the AI and ML space, that is absolutely critical right from the first stage of the process, because you really need to start thinking now about what your strategy is once you've completed the initial training of the system, and how that's going to adapt over time, and how you're going to continue to show that it's safe and effective. The commercial implications of leaving this too late are very significant, because if we're most of us around Europe are now waiting 9 months, 12 months for a notified body audit. If you get to that end goal and realize that you've got to go back and start again, there's huge implications for delays to your development program. But overall, 62304 is really all about good software design principles, and it doesn't actually need to be as daunting as it sounds. Okay, any questions from anybody? I haven't been able to monitor the chat, I'm afraid.
We do have one question that came while you were presenting, David. It's from Hagai. She says, does the CE provide the possibility to be classified as decision support and then be exempt from efficacy requirements? She says the FDA does, but she doesn't know about CE.
So it depends a little bit on your application. I think so. Perhaps we could talk about that in a little bit more detail. In recent years, they have been tightening up on claims that a device only provides a diagnostic support function, if that makes sense. So whereas many years ago you could say it was an aid to diagnosis, the clinician's decision was actually the final one. The MDR wording in particular has kind of strengthened that up a bit. I think if we pop back to slide 11, it talks about driving significant clinical decisions. Let's see if I can find the exact wording. Yeah, so they've strengthened up the wording here. information which is used to take decisions with diagnostic or therapeutic purposes. And you can sort of see from the wording there that the strength by which that diagnostic indication is given, and that the extent to which that is going to drive a clinical action is being focused on an awful lot more than it has been in the past. Perhaps can you tell us a little bit more about the specific application?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Again, I don't want to bore everyone, but the specific application that we are developing analyzes changes in physiological markers, which we basically measure using any Apple Watch or Fitbit. And then we provide, again, hopefully a decision support analysis on the effectiveness of the medical treatment in the ADHD area, attention deficit hyperactive disorder.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, as I talked about earlier, I think I would probably approach that by thinking about the broader context of how the information delivered by your system is going to be used. So obviously I don't know a huge amount of detail about it, but that does sound like it is sort of decision support software rather than as an individual data point. Your software is not going to say, I'm assuming, update the medication that they are taking by 10 milligrams. It's going to be providing supporting evidence saying they are, I don't know, jiggling about a bit less, or their activity profile is like this, in conjunction with the dose of stuff that you've been taking, maybe some other measurements, maybe some other observations, the patient's feedback, and your clinical experience. You're going to decide the treatment pathway. And so, you know, on the face of it, that and the rule that's sort of on the screen at the moment, that sounds like it would probably fall into a 2A kind of a classification, because it isn't, you know, if it were to go further, if it were to say, you know, this person is still suffering from whatever, you should therefore do this, that's when you start to get into the highest categories of providing a diagnosis. There's wording in the guidance these days which talks about directly driving a clinical decision, and in your case it sounds like that is probably not going to be, yeah, it is indeed, as you're intending, supportive information.
Thank you so much.
David, well, we have three people who've raised their hands. We'll take their question. Could Munya send the survey as well on the screen while you answer these questions, so that we can have everybody's survey done before they leave? Frederick, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep, great. So you mentioned the focus on continual follow-up on performance to maintain that quality is maintained over time. Now, many of us are in the machine learning AI space. We would expect our performance to improve over time. Is there any wording, or do you think there will be wording in the regulatory, in the regulations about how to follow up the expected improvement of performance in the device?
That is the $1 million question, I think, and is really the focus of the consultations that are out there at the moment. I think that you're correct that the point of doing much of these adaptive type processes is that they improve over time. I think in terms of the mechanics of data gathering and the mechanics by which you continue to improve the algorithm, they can be relatively well covered. I think the real essence of what they're concerned about is how confident are you that that is having a beneficial effect, and how do you prove it? I suppose there's a certain element. I mean, it's going to depend so much on the context of what you're doing, because for example, maybe the data gathered that initially trained the algorithm was done under lab-based conditions, for example. Maybe there's something in real-world conditions which you might want to train the algorithm, but until you've actually gathered some of that real-world data, how do you know it's going to have the intended effect on the algorithm, on all of those sorts of things? Yeah, the direction of travel seems to be to put the emphasis back on manufacturers to possibly sort of stage gate or prove on a regular basis that they are not getting less effective, if that makes sense. But I don't think anybody, because it's such a broad field and has such broad implications against a whole range of devices with a whole range of risks, I don't think anybody's really got a firm idea of how you write a regulation around that, which is broad enough to capture everything without having, well, the field is moving so fast that it's entirely possible by the time they've written the regulation it becomes out of date, and they'll be very much aware of that, so they'll be wanting to write something quite broad. I wouldn't be that surprised if they had everything these days is risk-based, so I wouldn't be surprised if they use the kind of some overall classification level to set the determination of risk of changing the or the algorithm changing. So in much the same way that a class 3 device, you have to have very active post-market clinical evaluation. If you've got class 3 software safety, class C AI/ML, you're probably going to have to be proving that on a very regular basis that it's still safe and effective, maybe annually or more. Whereas class 2A, class 1 decision support stuff, then don't think anybody knows how active that needs to be monitored yet, or what's proportionate to the risk in those devices.
Okay, thank you. Rosemary, you had a question.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you very much, David. That was fabulous. And I love the timely reminder that the regulations aren't out to get you. They're there to make you better. It's always great. I'm going to contextualize my question. I'm not actually working on a specific solution, but I am, a entrepreneur amplifier. So I'm often working either with software engineers that come to me with health ideas or healthcare workers that come to me with software ideas. And I want to encourage them, but my instinct is to get them to take this very seriously from the get-go. So my question really is, what is the very lowest bar a startup can shimmy under to avoid all of this? And I'm thinking of examples like yoga for back pain, like Calm app for stress management. Do they need to look at this, or where does that fall in the intended use?
I think it is all about the intended use, and so wellness and well-being is generally not regulated or not regulated yet, in the same way that medical devices are. There's no so the 82304 standard, for example, the health software standard, there's no regulation that sits behind that in any country that mandates the use of that, in contrast to medical devices in 62304. I think it's a really interesting area, because what you want to do is make sure they're being honest about their claim. So if it is yoga for back pain, then that is absolutely fine. But if it is kind of Yoga can be used to treat lower sciatic something or other, medical term I don't actually know. Well, once you start back pain is broad. It's non-specific. If it's being used to treat a condition, then you're really starting to stray quite close to the borderline of medical device. My favorite one is in a completely different category, but my favorite one is a cloth for cleaning glasses. So glasses are a medical device. If you have spectacles that correct vision, you'll see that it's got a CE mark on the side of it. Therefore, if you market a glasses cleaning cloth, you are marketing an accessory to a medical device. Nobody sells glasses cleaning cloths. Everybody sells lens cleaning cloths, because the lens cleaning cloth is intended by the manufacturer for cleaning lenses, all sorts of lenses, doesn't matter. Clean your sunglasses with them. So that's not a medical device. A glasses cleaning cloth is a medical device, but it's bonkers to sell it as a medical device. Nobody would do that. You can't make a better glasses cleaning cloth than a lens cleaning cloth. So that's where it's really important to get it right. And we have people come to us who say, I want this developed as a medical device, but it just isn't. We had a company a few years ago who wanted an assay for detecting drugs of abuse, and it's explicitly excluded from the detecting drugs of abuse is explicitly excluded from the medical device regulation rules. So it can't be a medical device. The wording's there that says it isn't. So there's no point in trying to claim it is. You can't get a notified body to come and audit you for it, because it isn't. But on the other hand, trying to shift to fly underneath the radar is difficult, and particularly if it means that one day you want to flip into real medical claims. If you think one day you're going to be making medical claims, I'd really encourage you to start from the outset developing as if you're a medical device, because going back and doing it later is huge amounts of cost.
Thank you, David. We have time for one last question. Jagadish also raised his hand.
Thanks, Caroline. David, thank you so much. I mean, for me, this medical device regulation subject is always too dry. I come from the biotechnology background, and my work was completely on animals. So, but for now, I'm kind of very, very curious to learn all this subject, because I believe future is digital. And I wish this digital was already there before COVID was here, but unfortunately we learned lesson very, very, very late. But my question actually is that in this process, what is EG technology doing? Like, how are you helping out people to make it simplify, or maybe this is another talk that you want?
Well, so
good question.
Yeah, so we do the design and development of medical devices. So we have teams here that do mechanical and industrial design, usability and human factors, electronics engineering, and software engineering. So we do provide an outsourced software development activity for people who want help developing their software. So we've got lots of experience taking multiple devices from Class A all the way up to the highest Class C through the regulatory approvals process. But what we've also done for some clients is kind of regulatory gap analysis type exercises. Now because we're fundamentally a group of engineers, where we're best at that is really looking at the bits related to engineering. So that includes software development. So if you want us to review your software development processes, or indeed review your software, then we can do that. But we can do similar things in terms of electrical safety, EMC, or human factors and usability, all of those sorts of things. The standards that really apply to the device itself, Where you probably want a separate kind of regulatory specialist is if you want a quality system being put into place, or to design and develop the processes for your own company. There are other companies out there that
So
provide that.
if I may put the question in a different way, as Rosemary said, like if a startup is venturing into something, maybe it's better they come to you, so you already tell them what to take care of it, right?
Well, so, I mean, we'd certainly, if there are any startups, if anybody on the call wants to follow up, then we'd be very happy to have an initial chat, share a bit more knowledge, give you some pointers on which way to go and how to get started. That doesn't have to mean you have to come and do put work with us. We're happy to talk to people just to give them an idea of the direction of travel and where they've got to go, because it's really important, particularly for startups, to decide what aspects of their development, what aspects of their technology they need to develop in-house, because it's absolutely core to the company's value, and what aspects of design and development or regulatory they can outsource, because using people who've got the skills and experience is a more cost-effective and quicker route to market.
Thank you, David. And I think I found this extremely insightful. I didn't know it was that complicated to add software to a medical device. So hopefully for the startups that are listening, this will give you a lot more insights about what to expect, what to anticipate in your product development and your regulatory pathway, which will allow you also to have all the answers to what investors might ask you, and you will be so knowledgeable that you will bring trust and reassure the investors that you know what you're doing, and you know where you're going, and you know how you're going to get there. So this is also part of the big pictures of you fundraising, you inspiring trust to your investors by knowing exactly where you're going with your company and your product. David Rouzet, thank you so much. Great to have you. As Rouzet allowed us to put this webinar on our EIT Health Investor Network YouTube channel, you can of course go back because there was so much info. Thank you, David. Very technical. So I think a lot of people might want to go back and listen to you again. And indeed, don't hesitate to contact Rouzet or David if you've got any questions or if you want to use their services, and don't hesitate to contact myself or Munya if you'd like more info about the Investor Network. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a great sunny weekend. I see that Rosemary in Ireland has loads of sun. Oh my gosh. It's not the case in Paris, but
not in the UK either.
Yeah.
No, not here.
Okay, guys,
miracle.
Great. Enjoy your weekend. Don't think too much about your product this weekend. Enjoy the time off and get back to it on Monday. Thank you so much. Rouzet,
Thank you very much.
if you can stay with us.
Yes. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.